Okay, folks, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for taking the time to log on to the webinar tonight. We'd like to provide you some feedback and some insights into the club audit undertaken between January and April 2020. And we're delighted to welcome Dave Barrett from Sheffield Hallam University, who has assisted us with the collection and the analysis of the information returned. Dave is a research fellow at Sheffield Hallam and has worked with a number of NGBs on audits and participation in competitions. So he is skilled in creation, management and the interpretation of large-scale databases. The survey of our clubs presented him with just that. So Dave, you're very welcome and thank you. So before handing over to Dave, I'd just like to acknowledge the work done by the volunteers and the staff in both the counties and the province. Without this help, we would not have been able to do the survey and of over 345 clubs make a full return to the questions posed in the audit. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of Dr. Paul Donnelly from GAA project and the support he provided in getting the questionnaire assembled. Insights into how we do our work and what we do is important on a number of fronts. It assists us with our planning and provides us with information. This is essential when we go to funders, to sponsors and to government departments, or when we're asked for feedback on investments that have been made. The audit is a moment in time, but it does highlight our strengths and our weaknesses, and it allows us to take steps to address some of the issues and the challenges that the insights present. This allows us to focus and dedicate our resources from what is becoming a very stretched budget. So on the back of this, we hope that counties can use the information and the insights in their planning going forward. So before I hand over to Dave, can I ask that you post any questions in the chat bar? And Gareth and Paul, who are on helping here, will help us address those at the end. And you should be on mute, hopefully just to avoid any interference. So I'm going to hand over to Dave and I'll come back to you at the end of the presentation. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Eugene, good evening, everyone. And can I first, before I actually get going with the presentation, the first thing I'd like to say is a huge thank you to everybody who completed the online survey. As you'll see, we had over 90% of the clubs in Ulster responding to this audit, and as a result of that, we have a very rich and comprehensive data set, which gives us a very detailed picture of the situation in GAA clubs across Ulster, and we're able to analyse that down to county level, and that really brings the data to life, because we're able to differentiate between clubs in different counties. We're able to differentiate between small, medium-sized and large-sized clubs. And we're also able to differentiate between clubs that provide different GAA codes. This will be, by necessity, something of a whistle-stop tour through the data. And it may be, if we're running short of time, that I have to skip a slide or two. I think Eugene will be pleased to share this as well, but the full report will be available very soon on the Ulster GAA website. So if there's something that does pique your interest that I don't go into detail on and that you think you might want to return to later, then the report will probably explain that in a level of detail that will satisfy your curiosity. Okay, so we undertook the audit as a result of being commissioned by Ulster GAA and GAA, and we've done more detailed work with GAA, including a participation survey and some analysis of their affiliation data. But this was the key point to get across here was this is a joint enterprise and a real partnership arrangement. So I'll just explain quickly the background to the survey and how we went about it, and then the backbone of the presentation is presenting the findings, and I'll highlight the top 10 findings that we took from the audit, and then suggest one or two policy implications, what that might mean, and what the next steps, what the response might be. So, who, what, and why? Well, we'll start with the why first, which is usually the best place to start. But we were commissioned to do this to inform the strategy development of both Antrim GAA and GAA and Ulster Council. And as I've said before, it's a strategic partnership between those organisations. The online survey was distributed to all clubs, and we took what we consider to be a uniquely collaborative approach. We've done exercises like this in the past with national governing bodies, but what we've never really done is we've never had governing body staff going into clubs and sitting down with representatives from those clubs to take them through the process. And in taking them through the process, start a conversation about what that data means to an individual club. And that's important because when you're trying to implement those next steps, when you're trying to respond to those policy implications, if you haven't had that conversation already, you might be coming from out of left field somewhat. Okay, so going straight into the findings. So we had responses from 372 GAA clubs. There are 372 GAA clubs across Ulster, and we got responses from 345, and that represents 93% of the sample, or the 93% of the population. So you can almost consider this a census, if you like, of GAA clubs. And what you see on the graph presented by county is the number of clubs, and the number of clubs of each of different sizes. Unfortunately, the colour coding on the left-hand side has slightly misrepresented the graph. So the blue bars at the bottom of the graph are the clubs with more than 300 participants. The medium-sized clubs, the red bars in the middle row of the graph, if you like, and the small clubs are the green bars at the top. And you'll see that the larger counties in terms of the number of clubs are Antrim, Armagh, Antrim, Armagh, Down and Tyrone. And if we look at the average club size in each of those counties, you'll see that there's quite some variation between the counties. So you can see there that the largest, the county with the largest clubs is Donegal. So that's in Donegal, each club has on average 509 members, and of those 327 are participant members, and that compares quite favourably with the average across Ulster, where the average club has 380 members and 241 players. Now that's instantly one thing that should jump out at you from that is that there is quite a sizable membership which isn't actually actively participating in any GAA codes, and that suggests that there is an opportunity. We'll come back to that in a moment, but if the senior members are those members who are less likely to participate, what can you as a club, and what can Ulster GAA and what can the county boards do to try and engage those members in some kind of active participation? Okay, so when we look at the profile of participants, a couple of things are immediately apparent. First and foremost, only roughly one in four members of, 1 in 4 participants, I should say, of GAA clubs in Ulster is aged 18 or over. So the overwhelming majority of participants at GAA clubs are juvenile members, under 18. And actually the biggest group is those aged 7 to 12. There is very limited, at the moment, I should stress this, at the moment there is very limited participation among people from black and minority ethnic communities and from non-traditional backgrounds. So either from Protestant backgrounds or from a background with no religion. And while that might start a conversation going in a particular direction, it's also important to point out that we are aware, and it's not shown on the graph here, but we are aware that there are variations by county, and to a certain extent this reflects the population profile of the counties concerned. So we know, for example, that in Antrim the percentage of participants from black and minority ethnic backgrounds and from non-traditional backgrounds is actually higher than this, and that reflects the balance of population, but it also reflects the fact that the length of time, for example, that a black and minority ethnic community has been established in a particular county and has engaged, usually through school in the first instance, but has engaged with GAA. When we look at the number of juvenile teams by code, it's very clear that football is the most popular. So the green bars on this graph refer to the number of juvenile teams in football, whether that's boys football or girls football. And again, this data is broken down by county. So football is clearly the more popular of the two codes, although the balance between the two is better in Antrim. It's still marginally football is still marginally the more popular code over hurling or camogie. And it's also very evident that there are one or two counties where the level of participation in hurling or camogie is much lower, and so the average club in Cavan, for example, has between 1 or 2 boys teams and maybe 2 camogie teams. In Fermanagh and Monaghan, there's very little camogie being played. That creates a bit of an issue because if there's only 1 or 2 clubs fielding teams at juvenile level or fielding teams at senior level in Eden, then those clubs have further to travel to find competitive fixtures. So that becomes a consideration. And again, when we look at senior teams, it's from this graph, it should be clear, and I hope it's clear, but football is the more popular code for men, but there is a better balance between the codes for women. So camogie, the gap between participation in ladies football and participation in camogie is smaller for women than it is for men, by and large. Again, the county by county variations stand out, are consistent with those at junior level. So the balance between codes in Antrim is closer, and participation in hurling and camogie in Fermanagh, for example, is much lower on the evidence of the number of teams being fielded than it is in football. So when we turn to the volunteer workforce, we have on average it's marginally under, but it's 59 or 60 volunteers per club. And again, that varies from county to county. And you'll see that the Donegal and Down have the highest number of volunteers per club. And it's from a research point of view, it's probably no coincidence that the largest clubs in Donegal are served by one of the largest volunteer workforces. When we look at different types of clubs and the size of the clubs, the variation between those becomes more stark. So clubs that are providing all codes tend to have more volunteers, and that may seem like something of a tautology. That may seem an obvious thing to say, but it depends on your perspective. And actually, the way we look at this is that the more volunteers a club has, the more it's able to do, rather than it's a supply-led phenomenon. So the more volunteers a club has, the more capacity it has, the more it's able to deliver, and the more capacity for growth it has in the long term. Interestingly, clubs that are providing football or ladies football and hurling or camogie have the largest volunteer workforce. So the inclusion of handball and rounders in this it doesn't seem to have that much of an effect. It seems to be from the data. It seems to be if a club is providing football and hurling, it's more likely to be providing rounders and handball, but it has a larger workforce in order to be able to deliver that. But the key thing to take from this graph really is that smaller clubs have smaller volunteer workforces and larger clubs have larger volunteer workforces. And again, that may seem an obvious thing to say, but from the evidence that we've seen, not just in GAA, but from other sports and from other surveys that we've done, the more volunteers you can recruit, the more volunteers you can develop, the more likely you are to have the capacity to grow and develop participation in your club, and to grow and develop your club as a whole, including the social aspect of your club. Again, when we look at the volunteer profile, you'll see that there's very little volunteering from people from black and minority ethnic groups, from people with a disability, and from people from a non-traditional background. Again, that's not necessarily a problem. This is the starting point. This is the first time we've done this, and for clubs to grow and for clubs to engage with people from those communities, the starting point, it's useful to know where you are now, and the measure of this, the measure of success in this, will be to see in a few years' time whether those figures have changed. Again, one key thing to pick out from this is that there are more than twice as many male volunteers as there are female volunteers, and that suggests that there's significant potential to actually recruit and develop and train and engage and retain more women volunteers. What's interesting from this as well is that 78% of volunteers in GAA clubs are of working age. So 41% are aged 25 to 44 and 37% are aged 45 to 64. So nearly 80% of volunteers in the GAA are of working age. And when we look at the roles that those clubs do, there are some roles that every club has someone in place to do that job. So if we take the average for Ulster is the amber line going across the graph, and you'll see that to the left of the graph we have roles such as chairman or chairwoman, secretary, treasurer, children's officer, coach, vice chair, county board delegate, public relations officer and registrar. And more than 90% of clubs on average have someone who is fulfilling that role. But if you look at the green lines, the lightest green line is the small clubs and the darker green line is the large club. And you'll see that there's a gap between the light green and the dark green lines on the graph. And that basically is highlighting the fact that smaller clubs are less likely to have volunteers in every role across the board. And that's because they lack the capacity in at least to some extent to be able to put someone in every role, to be able to find someone to do every job that needs doing in the club. Now again, you might look at this slightly differently and consider that some roles are essential and some roles are nice to have. It's nice to have a volunteer, but it's not actually essential, not absolutely essential to have someone in that role. So if we look towards the right hand end of the graph, you'll see that we have certain positions like a refreshment helper, for example, a juvenile secretary, a kit or equipment officer, and the juvenile secretary is a good example. On average, just under 50% of clubs have someone fulfilling that task, and again, larger clubs are more likely to have someone in that role. It's about 54%, and smaller clubs may only have 40 or 41% of clubs may have a juvenile secretary. But essentially what this graph is showing is that some roles are absolutely essential and every club has someone almost every club has someone in place, and the larger clubs are able to provide someone or to persuade someone to actually do those jobs. So if we look at coaching as a volunteering role, again, I've color coded these, so the coaches in football and ladies football are coloured in green, and the coaches in hurling and camogie are coloured in amber. So again, you'll see that first and foremost, if we look to the right hand side of the graph where the overall figures for Ulster are shown, there are more coaches available for football than there are for hurling and camogie. One other thing to highlight here is that the the greatest number of coaches are active in juvenile and youth football, and also in juvenile and youth hurling and camogie. It's also very clear that larger clubs have more coaching capacity, have much more coaching capacity. And if we look at the qualifications that those coaches hold, it's quite clear to see that the foundation level coaches holding foundation level qualifications are quite widespread. But the coaches with level 1 and level 2 certificates are much rarer. One of the things to highlight on this graph is that the coaches who have completed the Safeguarding 1 training programme and coaches who have been vetted by Access Northern Ireland or Angada Shikana, it's quite reassuring to see from this graph that actually most of the coaches that are in place in clubs around Ulster have been vetted and have completed the Safeguarding 1 programme. When we look at how coaches engage with workshops that are designed to develop them as coaches, we can see again the engagement with workshops in football is higher than it is for hurling and camogie. And again, to a certain extent, that's almost inevitable, because we know that there are more football coaches. We know that there are more qualified football coaches. We know that there are more people involved in that in the first place. But again, larger clubs have the ability, have the capacity to send more coaches to those workshops. And one way of looking at this might be to imagine a club with, say, for example, according to this graph, a small club that provides football might have 5 coaches available, and only one of them can attend. But if a large club has 20 coaches and is able to send 10, then they're likely to get more from that workshop. But I think the other important point to note here is that we're not saying that small clubs aren't engaging. What we're saying is that if someone from a small club cannot attend, then it's less likely that club can find someone to replace them. So it almost becomes a kind of a virtuous circle. When we look at officials, and again, this one of the volunteer roles that underpins community sport, and particularly in amateur sport, is the match officials. And you'll see from this graph that on average, clubs in Ulster have at least 1 young whistler in football, probably 2 adult referees in football, and 1 young whistler and 1 adult referee in hurling and camogie. And again, that contrast between the small, medium and large club is readily apparent here. I've included the Antrim figures on this graph just to show that actually when a concerted effort is made to recruit and develop officials, it can pay off. It can generate long-term dividends. So on average, clubs in Antrim, I should say, have 4 young whistlers and 2 adult referees in football, 3 young whistlers and 1 or 2 adult referees in hurling and camogie. And that's the result of a long-term concerted effort to push. Push is perhaps the wrong word, but a long-term concerted effort to recruit and retain and develop referees, match officials. Go Games blitzes. On average, clubs attend around about 20 Go Games blitzes per year, just over 20. So most of those, 17 on average, 17 of those take place within a club's own county, and maybe 4 or 5 maybe external to the county. And one thing that stood out from this graph and was quite an interesting thing from a research point of view, from my perspective, is that we asked clubs how much they charge for their own Go Games blitzes, and we asked how much they pay when they go to another club's Go Games blitz. And almost unanimously, every club said that they pay more to attend other clubs' Go Games blitzes than they pay for their own. Now, that could be a perception. That could just be a perception of how things are, or it could actually reflect what's going on the ground. We don't have the hard data to be able to match those two data sets to make that clear comparison. But there's certainly a perception out there that clubs pay more to attend other clubs' Go Games blitzes. Okay, the Healthy Club program. This graph basically essentially shows that of all the different strands of the Healthy Clubs program, it's the physical activity other than playing. It's the physical activity strand that is the most popular, that's being delivered by the most clubs. And every club that provides all codes, all GAA codes, is providing some form of physical activity other than playing. And then the other three strands that are really where provision is more widespread are the mental health, physical health, and keeping safe strands. Again, it's the larger clubs that are able to provide more. So a high percentage of large clubs are able to provide activity under all of those Healthy Club strands. But one thing that came out from the survey, one thing that came out from the audit, is that clubs want support in providing all of those strands of activity. Okay, so when we look at volunteers, one of the things that new participants and particularly parents look for when they're bringing children to a GAA club to get them involved in football or hurling or handball or rounders, they want to know that their children will be safe. They want to know that their children are going to be coached by people who have been vetted. And again, the amber line running across the graph shows the percentage of clubs whose volunteers have been vetted in each of these individual roles. And again, it's quite reassuring that 80% of clubs say that all of their coaches have been vetted. And actually, even for small clubs, that figure is very close to the average for Ulster. But again, it's the larger clubs that are more likely to have vetted their volunteers, irrespective of the role that they undertake. And that's probably, again, because there is the volunteer capacity to fill out the forms, to put the people through the process. The club safeguarding statement. So nearly 80% of clubs have completed a valid statement. And 60% have been vetted. 60% of those working with children have been vetted through Access NI or Angada Shikana. And of all those working with children in the club, just over 80% have had that safeguarding and child protection training. Moving on to Club Moi. So just over 40% of clubs in Ulster are engaged with the Club Moi programme, but relatively few have completed. It's about 12%. Again, there are notable variations by county. So you can see that Fermanagh, for example, 3/4 of clubs in Fermanagh have engaged with that Club Moi process, and a higher percentage than the Ulster average. Again, just over 15% have actually completed the process. The highest percentage of completions is actually in County Down. We asked clubs to tell us how much income they generated for the past 2 seasons, and how much they'd spent. And what's interesting about this graph is that expenditure, which is the amber bars, the dark and light amber bars, expenditure has increased between 2017-18 and 2018-19. Now, obviously, we haven't collected data from the current season, and that's clearly going to show a very different picture. But what was interesting was to see that expenditure had risen, but income had kept pace. In fact, it had kept ahead of expenditure in most cases. Most clubs run at just about break even. So if you look across the graph where you see the green bar higher than the orange bar, essentially clubs there are running at a small surplus, and that's the case across Ulster. Again, there are one or two clubs where that's not the case, but there might be specific reasons for that. We're aware, for example, that there was quite a large distribution of grant funding to clubs in Cavan, and that kind of skewed the figure because that grant funding has to be spent once it's received by the club. So you'll see that the picture for Cavan is slightly skewed there. The other thing we didn't ask clubs was how much cash they held in reserve, so how much money they had in the bank. And that may skew the picture. So a club that spends a large amount of money in 1 year to complete a development project or to engage with a employ a coach may have cash in the bank to be in reserve to be able to do that, or they may not. If they don't, then it becomes more of an issue. Again, it's the contrast that stands out here is between clubs, small clubs, medium clubs, and large clubs. And again, what you'll see there is that for each of those 3 types, for small clubs, medium clubs, and large clubs, income has grown, and so has expenditure across the 2 seasons. But if anything, what stands out to me is that at large clubs, the surpluses, if you look carefully at the graph, the large clubs have larger surpluses, so they're able to reinvest that into their club, and maybe that explains why they're able to deliver more and to generate more volunteer capacity in the long run. That virtuous circle kicks in again. We asked clubs about their provision of Irish language and culture, and most clubs say that they do promote Irish language and culture. Participation in SCORE is highest in Donegal, which again to a certain extent we would expect to see that, Donegal being a Gaeltacht area, but it's encouraging that clubs are engaging with SCORE and Scorn and Og, but it's not quite universal, and there is room for growth. You might say in some counties, in Antrim, Armagh, and Derry. Now, your own experience of this may not reflect what's on the graph, but this is certainly the average picture at county level. It's also quite clear that where a club hasn't engaged to date with SCORE or Scorn and Og, those clubs are keen to find out more. The last point to make on this graph is that most clubs, again, more than 2/3 of clubs, and this again, it does vary, and the percentage figure is highest in Donegal. Most clubs have someone responsible for the promotion of the Irish language. So if we look at SCORE and Scorn and Og, this is an indication of the spread of activities. And again, you'll see that Donegal stands out as having the highest level of engagement with SCORE and Scorn and Og across the board. But it's also clear that there's some way to go in persuading clubs in some parts of Ulster to engage with the competition. When it comes to use of the Irish language within clubs, we asked respondents to what extent they were using the Irish language within their clubs, and this graph actually shows the percentage of clubs that are using the Irish language to a significant or reasonable extent, and fewer than half of all clubs are using Irish to a significant extent in the delivery of Irish language classes, but generally in promoting the club on social media, in competitions and events, in running the club in a social context and in a coaching capacity. So again, there is room for growth in that area. We asked clubs about their facilities, and it was very clear even from an early stage in the survey that most clubs own their ground, but the majority also use public facilities to some extent. Clubs in Antrim are more likely to have to hire facilities, so the ownership of the extent to which clubs in Antrim own their own facilities is lower, and therefore they're more reliant on relationships with schools, for example, or leisure centres. And just to give you an example, we drilled down into the facilities, and we looked at not just the number of the number of facilities that each club had, but also the quality of those facilities. So the bars on the graph identify how many of each facility a club has. So most, on average, a club has between 3 and 4 changing rooms. And again, the larger clubs have more changing rooms. But if you look if you look at the lines on the graph, you'll see that the quality of those facilities tends to be better at the larger clubs as well. So larger clubs have more facilities, and those facilities are of a higher quality. And that applies to the sporting facilities, the indoor sporting facilities, and to outdoor pitches. So I think this is probably the in terms of facilities, this is the key. Clubs have 1 pitch on average. Again, we would expect that, but larger clubs are more likely to have more than 1 pitch. That doesn't mean that every large club has 2 pitches, 2 full-size pitches, but they're more likely to have a larger number of pitches. They're also more likely to have a training facility, a training pitch, a small-size training pitch. And those clubs are more satisfied with the quality of those facilities. So the highest line on the graph, and I'll try and use the mouse. I hope this is visible. So again, this is satisfaction with the quality of full-size grass pitches, club by club. And again, it should be apparent that large clubs are more satisfied with the quality of their facilities. We asked clubs about their development plans for the future, and there's an encouraging level of engagement so far. Just under half of all clubs currently have a club plan, and those that don't are keen to engage. They are interested in registering with the planning programme. On average, if a club does have a plan, it's due to expire late in 2021, so it has just over a year to run. We asked clubs about their historical publications, and most clubs have published at least published at least one historical publication, and again, those that haven't, there is evidence of demand for clubs to actually engage in that process. And then coming to the end now, we asked clubs how satisfied they were with the support that they received from their county board, and that level of satisfaction is generally high, especially in Fermanagh and Monaghan, and more neutral to an extent in Armagh, but by and large, clubs are generally satisfied or very satisfied with the amount of support that they get from the amount of support and the quality of the support that they get from their county board, and that's indicated by the green bars on the graph. And again, asking the same question of Ulster GAA, it's generally high across the board. It's generally over 50%, although that does vary, and it's slightly lower in Donegal. But that figure doesn't vary so much as it does with the county boards. Okay, so the top 10 findings, the headlines, if you like, to draw from the research. The first is the popularity of football across Ulster, and with the strength of the various counties in the All Ireland Championships over recent times, that probably comes as no surprise. But in contrast, point two, there is room for growth in hurling and camogie. But as we've seen, that's dependent on the volunteer workforce being available to support that, and to encourage people to participate through high quality coaching. There's possible scope for a kind of back to GAA, to expand the recreational game, and this draws on what other governing bodies in other sports have done. So in netball in England, for example, England Netball have run a very successful back to netball program, which has been targeted solely at people who used to play netball and have stopped and would like to take up some form of participation again. There's a similar scheme running in hockey, and both of those inevitably in netball, but certainly in hockey, both those schemes have been targeted at women in the 30 to 45 age group. The next point of note is that participation is well supported by qualified coaches. Again, in contrast to that, officiating and refereeing needs to be pushed harder, and the evidence from the audit suggests that where that does take place, it is effective. Running GAA clubs. So the volunteer workforce is generally in good shape. Most clubs feel that they have enough volunteers, although almost every club says that it would be happy to see more, and if they could have one more type of volunteer, it would be a coach. Clubs are aware of the various programs and the support from their county boards and from Ulster GAA and from the GAA in Dublin, but they don't always access them. Most clubs are financially sound, but there are some unknowns. We don't know to the extent to which clubs are having to draw down on their cash reserves to keep going through the pandemic, for example. And that's because the survey was actually completed before the pandemic kicked in and before lockdown started. There's clear room to grow language and culture, the provision of Irish language and culture within clubs, and overall clubs are generally satisfied with their relationship between clubs and county and Ulster board, or Ulster Council, I should say. Sorry. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, in digesting the data, we are helping to support the formulation of strategy from 2021 to 23, and we hope that this data will support clubs as they emerge from lockdown. even if that lockdown comes back into play. We're developing helping to develop a plan for clubs with key action using evidence-based planning for future club support. And that goes back to one of the first things I said. When we're looking at target groups, we're looking at the number of females that are involved in participation and involved in volunteering, the number of people from black and minority ethnic groups, the number of people with a disability or from non-traditional backgrounds. The figures might look they might look quite stark, if you like, but it's still absolutely essential to know where clubs stand now, if that plan to engage with those communities, that plan to reach out and to draw more people into GAA clubs and to involve them in GAA is to take place. And again, the fruits of that will become evident if we'll know that strategy has been successful if those figures change in a few years' time. So next steps. Well, the first is to disseminate the findings to clubs and counties, which we're in the process of doing now, and to integrate the results into the strategic planning process. And that's, to a certain extent, that's already happened. When I originally presented these slides to the Ulster Council, my strong recommendation was that they ought to be shared with the National GAA, and that again has already happened, and it started a discussion. And the obvious next step would be to track changes over time. So we need to consider how participation is monitored and recorded, how affiliations and the demographic data in clubs is monitored and recorded. We need to fill in the gaps. There were some clubs that didn't respond, and we're not here to name names, or we're not here to point fingers. Inevitably, when we do these exercises, some clubs don't have that capacity, and it may well be that it's the smaller clubs that we're saying don't have that capacity to be able to collect that data together. So we want to engage with those clubs and bring that data in and get the conversation going in those clubs, in those smaller clubs. We need to implement programs that focus on club planning and support, and give those a real push. Club Moy, there is a level of interest in Club Moy, but actually to date the level of engagement so far isn't perhaps what it could be, and maybe that just needs a boost. There are clearly lots of volunteer development opportunities for administrators and coaches and officials, but again, it's evident that not all clubs are able to engage with those. So we need to consider how we can encourage those people from those clubs to become involved. And the last one, as I've referred to a couple of times, it's that wider engagement with targeted groups. And again, knowing where we are on that score gives us that starting point. It gives us that building block to say, well, okay, if this is our strategy, here's our starting point. And if we want to be at, if we want to increase that, increase that level of engagement among targeted groups, we know what we need to do now. Okay, that's it from my point of view, from the presentation point of view. I hope you found that interesting and engaging. I'm more than happy to take any questions. Eugene, over to you.
David, I'm going to come on here now. Just a few questions come into the chat box, so hope you don't mind. I'll just go through them. There's about 3 or 4 came in here. So
sure.
The first one, not directly related to the audit, but how is COVID affecting sport outside of Ulster?
Well,
you don't know yet.
Very good question. Very big question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very. There's a couple of things to say on that score. One of the first things is we're aware from the work we do on this side of the Irish Sea that one of the first consequences of COVID is that schools and universities and other public bodies are more reluctant to open their facilities at in the evenings and at weekends, and for clubs that need access to public facilities, that's quite a serious issue. That's not to say that there aren't solutions, but that does create a problem. The monitoring of participants in terms of track and trace can be patchy. Some clubs do it very well, some clubs do it very badly, or aren't perhaps doing it to the same extent. Again, the big thing that drives that, the thing that makes the biggest difference on that score is volunteer capacity. So if a club's got lots of volunteers that are able to, if they're able to assign that role to someone, to say, okay, well, can you do the job of monitoring who's taking part and making sure that everybody registers each time they participate, then that club's more likely to operate in the first place. I know from my experience, I play hockey at weekends. My club's quite a large club. We've got 7 men's teams and 4 women's teams. We've got lots and lots of volunteers. We have someone who's able to do that. In contrast, another club in Sheffield that has far fewer teams and far fewer volunteers, they just haven't been able to get that going. So they haven't been able to play any friendlies, and they're very, very concerned that they won't be able to engage in competition. Now, I'm not saying that absolutely applies to GAA, but it's very easy to draw parallels between the two. Yeah,
understandable. Another question here: if this audit was repeated, is there anything you would advise to enhance the audit, or is there anything you would do differently?
Yes and no. I think with the engagement of GAA staff in the process is almost unique. I think we've discussed this elsewhere, but the fact that staff from the NGB went out to the clubs and sat down with them and went through their figures actually opened up that conversation, and it really did drive the numbers higher in the survey. I think having done it, having gone through that process, first and foremost, if we did it again, clubs would have a better idea of what to expect. Yeah, I think the experience of going through it might seem traumatic to have to pull all that data together, but once it's done, repeating the process becomes easier. I think we might reduce, if we were to do it again, we might reduce the number of questions and try and simplify some of those questions. So some of the questions we're in just to get a feel for particular issues at one particular time, but we'd want to keep abreast of participants from different backgrounds. We want to know how many teams clubs were fielding. We'd want to know what facilities were in use, and whether clubs were having to pay, whether clubs were experiencing any problems accessing facilities. So, and the other thing to say is, again, having done this, it's given us a unified picture across Ulster. If we were to use club affiliation data, we'd be pulling data together from 3 different governing bodies, from the GAA, the Ladies Gaelic Football Association, and from the Camogie Association. And anytime you're drawing from multiple sources, you introduce a potential for error. So to get the data from the horse's mouth, if you like, in one hit, yeah, we appreciate it was, it might not have been easy, but it was well worth it in the end.
Yeah, understand. Yeah, good stuff. Just another question here. Perhaps not unexpected, the findings show larger clubs have greater capacity across the board. Has the survey flagged any warning signs regarding the viability of some of our smaller clubs?
Not specifically, no. We don't. We haven't got red flags against specific clubs saying, well, that this club is clearly experiencing issues. That said, there was some qualitative feedback, some open-ended questions in the survey, and clubs were able to express to express that if they chose to, or if they wanted to. The other thing I would say is that again, one of the things we're able to do, and at the back end of the report, which will be online, you'll see that there are county by county tables, and one of the things that comes out from that is it's possible to establish what's the ideal ratio between the number of members and the number of volunteers. You know, what's the how many volunteers do you need to keep a club of 500 members going, 500 members and 350 participants, for example? What's the ideal ratio for a club that has 100 members and 75 participants? You know, we can look at that, and where we can see that a club has fewer than that, well, that's maybe where a club could be identified and given that additional support. It's one of the paradoxes of volunteer sport. The clubs that need the most support are the least able to access it, because they're probably less likely to be engaged with their county board or with their national governing body. They probably spend all their time just running the club from day to day, and they're less able to do that strategic thinking, that long-term planning and development, looking beyond the horizon. And so, yeah, I've made this point talking to England hockey in a different context, saying that if you want to support the sport, it's the small clubs that probably need the support most. To a certain extent, it is. Some of those small clubs are quite happy the way they are, but it's the small clubs that are less likely to have the capacity to do this work in the first place, less likely to be engaged. Okay,
very good. A few questions come in very similar, so I'll just try and combine them.
Okay.
I think it's the last question, or two parts to it anyway. Do you think the back to GAA idea could be targeted at the lower ages, as the GAA has a higher dropout at younger ages? To follow up on that, as you mentioned netball, how did they go about addressing the playing deficit?
So sorry, could you just repeat the first bit of that question?
Yeah. Do you think the back to GAA idea could be targeted at lower ages, as GAA has a high dropout at younger ages?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to. One thing I would say right here and right now is that all sports experience that dropout. So that's universal across all sports, maybe with the possible exception of bowls. But all sports experience that dropout rate. So, and it comes down to key points in an individual's progression through their life. So, as you go through school, there comes a point where PE is no longer compulsory, and participation in sport generally drops. Participation in sport among young women generally drops when they're in secondary school. When you get to the end of secondary school, there's another drop in participation. Some people go to university and they maintain that, but when they get to the end of university and they start working, there's that drop off. So yes, I take the point. There is scope to try and encourage people back into the various GAA codes. But the reason that England netball and England hockey targeted those age groups was from the large scale surveys that Sport England do. It was quite evident that there was latent demand. So there was quite a large market of people to be able to tap into, for clubs to tap into, to say, well, you might have played netball or hockey in the past. Why don't you give it a go? Come back to us. We're providing casual participation. It's not competitive. The emphasis is on fun. You know, we're providing it at times and locations that are convenient to you. And actually, that's one of the big things. So rather than providing activities in the evening when people might have childcare responsibilities, they were targeting activities mid-morning. So it was aimed at people who dropped their kids off at school and then had time available. People working part-time, people who people who have that ability to access a session during the day. So there were specific reasons for it, and it was very effective as a result. And it's just a consideration. And you might also draw a parallel with walking football. There's been a big growth in walking football among men aged 50 and above, and that started as provision aimed at people who were either less active or inactive, and they were targeting them for participation for health reasons, trying to get them involved in some form of participation. And again, that's been successful, but there were specific reasons for it, and it was targeted very specifically.
That's lovely. Thanks for answering all the questions. They're very clear answers there now, I think. So that's already covered there now. So I'll just hand you back there to Eugene now to conclude this evening's webinar.
Okay, thanks Paul for managing the questions there, and thanks to Dave for his excellent presentation. And thanks to everyone for their contribution tonight, and to Dave for his insights and for managing our questions. I suppose we hope that this audit document will help you and the county in your planning moving forward. I think that's one of the key things behind this. And if a more in-depth document is required by your county, if you get in touch with me and we can have a chat around that. But again, just thanks to Dave and Paul for their support, and also to the Sports Council NI for their financial support to get this piece of work completed. Thanks to Paul Callahan and Gareth Thornton for facilitating the session this evening. And finally, thanks to the county boards for supporting the process, and to your staff for their assistance in the audit. There are a few surveys, I think, that have had a 93% positive response, and that has to be commended. So thanks to all of our clubs. So it is a process that we hope to repeat, as Dave has suggested, and one that we'll hope to fine tune. Hence that question around, how we could do things slightly different. And we would welcome our county's support moving forward. It won't be an annual event, thank goodness for that. But it certainly will. Even pieces of it might be done on an annual basis, on a smaller basis. So the session tonight was really for our counties, for our county officials and our provincial officials, and it's good to see all of our counties have been represented tonight, and hopefully you'll take the message back. There's an opportunity to hear the session again on Wednesday night, where we're targeting our clubs. So we've asked our county secretaries to circulate that to our clubs, and the full report will be posted on the Ulster GAA website after Wednesday night, so that'll be available to everyone. So again, just thanks to Dave for tuning in with us. The internet has been good to us, and otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you for staying with us, and stay safe, and please come back on Wednesday night if you want to hear it all again. Okay, have a good night. Cheers. Bye.